Sabah al-khair, good morning. Thank you everyone for joining us today on this session for track 5, which is looking at water, food, land, and the ocean. And our session today is collaborating around common resources to scale up adaptation and resilience. This session will look at the value of cross-sectoral, cross-country, regional, and institutional collaboration to address key challenges and leverage opportunities and these priorities as they relate to adaptation, transformation, and long-term resilience for these sectors. For anyone who works in the region, I think you're all quite familiar with Dr. Osama Fakiha and his as a champion of integration and collaboration across these sectors. I'd like to invite him now, Dr. Fakiha, to come give us out his keynote speech for this session.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to the MENA week. Assalamu alaikum, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think has been introduced, there is great integration between all these topics, energy, water, food, climate, biodiversity, that cannot be overlooked. And this is all really boils down to the fact that environment is very complicated, very valuable, very fragile, and provide essential services to all species, humankind and other species. And this could be summarized in the ecosystem services that we take from environment for granted, and most of the time in our modern lifestyle, in our concrete forest, we don't connect with the environment directly and get to appreciate the services. In various studies, I think many of you have seen it, it estimates the value of the ecosystem services that provided to us exceed more than double the global GDP, around $140 trillion per year, and that's, of course, the more we expand, the more we utilize out of these services. The question is, how can we sustain it? Now, with the significant increase in global population, almost 7-fold in about 2 centuries, and each individual consuming more. Now, the average inhabitants in the living today, in terms of water, material, and energy consumption per person, is way higher than those individuals who roamed the earth 100 years ago. And that's really provided a lot of amenities to us. Comfort in transportation, comfort in living, in access to goods and services, but it came with a hefty price. And we start to see the byproduct of that in climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, and this required that we look at the whole thing in totality. In 1992, in the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, which is a historic milestone for humanity, 3 major framework agreements were really resulted out of that historic event, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNCBD, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. To achieve our objective of environmental sustainability, which is a pillar to continue prosperity and economic growth for coming decades, we need to address all of them in totality. For example, if you don't care for land, we will impact both biodiversity, climate, and as well as food. 99% and more of 99% of the food generated globally is coming from land resources. So a degradation in land will huge impact on food. Also biodiversity. The majority of habitats are land based, so the loss of forest, the loss of rangelands, the loss of flora has the biggest impact. You know, the WWF Living Planet report issued, I think back in 2018, estimate that between 60 and 70% of biodiversity loss is associated with habitat loss linked to land degradation, a huge one, and also 5 to 10% related to climate change. But we can see now the issue of land is not being addressed properly. If you look at the water resources, 75% of freshwater resources globally comes from, watersheds that are covered by vegetation cover, because otherwise you have an ability to really capture the water into surface and underground water reservoirs. So you can see the interconnectedness. When you talk about climate change, 3 times, the carbon in soil and vegetation is 3 times the carbon in the atmosphere. So if you start to have soil degradation, loss of vegetation cover, we will lose huge, sink, and we will amplify climate, and also climate impact forest and impact vegetation as well, and impact soil. So it is intricate and interrelated relation. According to IPCC, more than 24% of greenhouse gases are related to various land use issues, 14% to 15% to transportation. I think the amount of discussion between land use and transportation is very clear that there is a disparity in the discussion. Oceans are very important. We are having significant impact on coral reefs and ocean resources, fisheries resources, plastic pollutions. So really, the continuing environmental degradation will limit our utilization of the environmental services, and will also have environmental impacts and health impacts and other issues like loss of biodiversity and climate change. So what to do? I think the answer is, first of all, to address environment in totality, to work nationally, regionally, and internationally, to engage stakeholders, government entities, to set policies, set strategic directions, private sector to be fully participating and include environmental sustainability in their business models, the public at large, the NGOs. They have to really take ownership of environmental issues and make sure that really their environmental footprint is really low. Academia, science is very important to really tell us how we are impacting the environment, what is the best mitigation measures, what is the best adaptation tools, how can we really better achieve our economic growth while preserving environment, the continuous generation of innovative ideas that really provide the solutions and the benefits we need at the lowest environmental footprint. In Saudi Arabia here, there is a great understanding and acknowledgement of the importance of the environment that has been really reflected on actions on the ground through issuing the National Environmental Strategy, restructuring the entire environmental sector, creating 5 national environmental sectors to care for waste management, for environmental compliance, for desertification, for wildlife and biodiversity, to do climate studies. We have updated the environmental laws and actually have many initiatives to address all environmental aspects. The Saudi Green Initiative is a very strong example about the commitment of Saudi Arabia work on environmental matters and really establish facts on the ground. The Middle East Green Initiative is an example of how we should work regionally, on a regional level. In the Middle East Green Initiative, we have many targets, all aiming toward enhancing preservation of environment, really reducing environmental footprint, and creating value in economic, social, and environmental aspects. Globally, there is several global initiatives. The G20 Global Land Initiative, which is really supported by all G20 leaders, but actually really invites G20 and non-G20 countries to really work and collaborate on land conservation. The global R&D platform in coral reef. Coral reef is extremely valuable marine resources of immense value to habitats, to fisheries, to shoreline protection, to ecotourism. Hundreds of millions of people rely on coastal habitats and coral reef in the front for their livelihood. You all know about the Kingdom Initiative in Circular Carbon Economy, both nationally and globally. So really engaging all stakeholders, not only national, but also be active regionally and internationally, and acting on the environment as a whole is a very important aspect. We currently now working on developing the circular economy strategy to really aiming to conserve resources, enhance recycling and material utilization, and really embed circularity and sustainability in all sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for really mapping us through and walking us through how interconnected these sectors really are, and how highlighting you can't address one challenge without addressing all of them. And for also setting the scene of how important it is to work internally, as the Kingdom has done, but also externally and regionally and globally through the MGI and through the G20 initiatives. So we're going to turn to our panel, our esteemed panel who are joining us today, to look at some of these best practices. With us today, we have Ms. Margaret Jones-Williams, the Deputy Resident Representative for the UNDP here in the Kingdom. We have also Dr. Mhamadou Tunkara, Regional Director, Middle East for MENA for the Global Green Growth Institute. Ms. Aya Salah, Program Policy Officer, Resilience and Climate for the World Food Programme. We have also Ms. Nouran Ataf from UNEP for the Finance Initiative, as well as Dr. Bradley Hiller, Lead Climate Mitigation Specialist with Islamic Development Bank. Thank you for joining us today. So we will have a round of questions, and then we will turn to the audience to see if there's any additional questions from your side, and then have another round. So to start, I'd like all of my panelists to address what key lessons learned, best practices, and opportunities exist for collaboration around shared resources in order to scale up adaptation and resilience regarding water, food, land, and oceans. And I'd like to turn first to Ms. Margaret, if you could please address this for the disaster risk reduction lens.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And I'd like to acknowledge Your Excellency, Deputy Minister of MIWA, my colleagues on the panel, and ladies and gentlemen. Now, we know that climate change is one of the greatest existential threats to mankind, and of course, including the MENA region. Climate change is exacerbating water scarcity, food insecurity, land degradation, and ocean ecosystem health. Excellency spoke to these issues, and is therefore making our habitat, our Earth habitat, less secure for us to live in. I recently served in Suriname in South America, one of 9 Amazon countries, and it's not hard to spot the differences when I arrived here in the kingdom and in the MENA region. Suriname has 93% forest cover, and while it has quite a lot of rainfall, and on the other hand, we are in a water-scarce, arid region, climate change is on one hand exacerbating, as I said, water scarcity and making dry, hot climates hotter and drier, and on the other hand, increasing water-related hazards in the countries that have access to water. So we have to address all of these issues. The MENA region is a climate hotspot, literally. And 14 out of the 20 most water insecure countries exist in this region. So the need for adaptation for water, land, agriculture, ocean systems to reduce the impact of hazards cannot be overstated. We know that, as I said, climate change is making our habitat less secure. Minister also referred to areas where communities live. And sometimes communities are placed in marginalized areas, low-lying coastal areas, steep slopes, which put them at risk for climate impacts. Slope instability, storm surge, sea level rise. So we also have to address the disaster risk reduction from a section of policy and governance to ensure that housing developments, infrastructure are placed in appropriate sites and are properly governed and zoned. From UNDP's perspective, we are providing a lot of support and enhancing the implementation of the NDCs through our climate promise to over 85% of developing countries, including 9 of the Arab states. And the Climate Promise program seeks to support countries in enhancing their NDCs and to making their NDCs relevant to the country context. I'd just like to stress that we need to support and strengthen science-based interventions for disaster risk reduction, to have modernization and standardization of data collection and information systems. Early warning systems are extremely important as an adaptive measure for climate change using integrated communication systems. These can include communities, policy interventions, and science. I mentioned modernization because we have moved very rapidly over the last few years into a digital age, and the Kingdom, of course, is leading in this region on digitization. And this is important for ensuring that we have up-to-date information and information that can be shared and transmitted in real time in order to improve responses to reducing disasters and risks. It is a key priority for us to address the nexus between climate action and disaster risk reduction. We know that not all disasters are climate related, but many of them are. And we particularly need to reflect on the decisions at COP27, which was adopted as the adaptation COP, where a lot of discussion noted that the climate impacts accelerate all the disasters, and we need to invest more in reducing the risks, investing in loss and damage avoidance. And this is an urgent priority, and early warning systems is one area that requires attention and financing. I would just like to add also the importance of local communities as well as municipalities, subnational governments in disaster risk reduction, in ensuring that development plans have disaster risk reduction mainstreamed in the planning process, and to ensure proper integration and stakeholder participation, engagement of communities. Linking to this, to address the gender issues. We know that climate impacts men and women, youth, elderly, persons with disabilities differently. And so we have to ensure the mainstreaming of gender throughout the planning process through strong consultative processes. Differential impacts cannot be underestimated. I would just like to reflect on the collaborative mechanisms that exist. Climate and climate impacts are not related to any single country, and this is a transboundary issue. And we cannot find solutions independently. We have to work together. Working together, I have several UN colleagues on the podium here, working together within the UN. The UN agencies have been addressing climate issues and supporting various countries to address their climate needs. We are also working with the financial institutions, the IFIs. We are working with communities on the ground. We are working, Minister reflected on private sector. We are working with the private sector, and importantly, we are working with the national governments. We have to do this together. So I will pause there, Madam Moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for emphasizing a number of different issues that have been coming up all week, including bringing in the communities, looking at how our cities are zoned, as well as the importance of policy and governance at the national and local levels, as well as data sharing. For the next round, I'd like to see if Dr. Mohammadou can address the same question on lessons learned and best practices, but for integrating, adaptation solutions across these sectors.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be in the panel today, and I would like to echo His Excellency Osama's keynote speech on some of the key issues that we need to address when it comes to climate change and the need to accelerate the adaptation solutions. But more importantly, looking at it from a holistic perspective. Quite often, we have the sectoral policies or sectoral strategies, and you go to many countries where you have technical ministries not talking to each other. Just to give you a simple example of where some of these challenges are. So I'd like to touch on a few points. One being on, I think, the holistic approach into addressing the impact of climate change on the communities, on the countries, require that we look at a few things. Let me start with the access to green and climate finance. I think currently, when you go to many forums, there is a consensus that we need to work faster, we need to invest more. The question is how fast we are mobilizing the resources. If you look at, for example, the COVID-19, which was a very difficult and sad situation, one thing that COVID-19 taught us is that when there is political will, we can mobilize money. Trillions of dollars were mobilized in a very short period of time to address the COVID pandemic. It means there is capital there. When we talk to investors, there is funding available, but the quality of projects are not there. And when we talk to project developers, they have a lot of ideas, but they are struggling to access the funding. So bridging that finance gap is an important area that we need to work on. So the speed at which we are mobilizing finances, as well as the scale of the solutions, for now, are not matching the magnitude of the issues we are dealing with. That's number one. The number two is that quite often, when you look at the very ecosystem that people rely on for their livelihoods, for their income generation activities, there are stress whenever you have internally displaced people because of climate. So the solutions provided to address the humanitarian assistance part of the issues, I think it's important to link that to the long-term development so that we break that cycle of constantly being in recovery into humanitarian assistance, but we build solutions where people can develop their livelihoods, their income generation activities. So that systematic link between the humanitarian assistance and the long-term development imposed to all of us to work together. The third one is on the conflict side of climate. The water wars, if I can use that term, is something that we have seen for a long time now between communities. Whenever you have displacements of people coming to new areas, that stress on the existing resources and create conflict. And wherever you have conflict taking place, the communities which are affected by the conflict are quite often the ones that are less likely to receive support because of the situation, the challenges in accessing those conflict areas. So I want to touch on another area which is more at the planning stage. The reactive, I would say the reactive approach that we are having in many situations means that when we bring solutions, it's already too late. So Margaret mentioned the preparedness. It's an important one. To what extent the the disaster preparedness is built into the planning documents is a key one. We need to be proactive enough to make sure that we don't wait for the disaster to hit in order to start running. By the time you get there, it's too late. It doesn't mean it's going to avoid having the disaster, but at least it will attenuate the impact of the disaster when the readiness is put in place at the planning stage. At the same time, I think part of the success we have in GGGI that we have been able to demonstrate is that in many countries, whether there are LDCs or countries in the Sahel or some of the countries in the Middle East, access to climate finance can be facilitated by de-risking the investments. Private sector has the funding, they are interested, but the risk sometimes limits their involvement in providing the funding. So doing the blended finance, where the de-risking mechanism or the guarantee mechanism are built in there, is something that we've been able to do. Over the past 5 years, we mobilized about $12.5 billion of green and climate finance, 60% coming from the private sector, because of the guarantee mechanism and the de-risking mechanism we built into that blended finance. So it's possible to bring the private sector, but the mechanism needs to be in place. And the last item I would like to touch on is more on the institutional part of it. So most of the institutions were set up a long time ago, not adapted to the reality of today. So I think when we bring solutions or work with governments and we provide the support in terms of capacity building, we also need to emphasize on the institutional development. The institutional capacity building is an important one. And that institutional capacity building is related to, is also important when it comes to the role of the decentralized institutions at the provincial level, at the community level. Their role in the implementation of the climate ambitions set by the governments are key, which means that they should not be only at the implementation stage, but they are part of the design, they are part of the planning, they need to own it. So the more stakeholders you have around the table, the more likely that you build that ownership and the more likely that the solutions you implement are sustainable. So those are what I would like to highlight here. For some of you who may not know GGGI, the Global Green Growth Institute is chaired by His Excellency Ban Ki-moon. The headquarters is in Seoul, South Korea, and it's a member state treaty-based organization embedded in government institutions to support the member state transition their economies into a green growth model through solutions which link policies and investments and innovative funding mechanisms. One of the recent innovative mechanisms we developed is the debt for nature swap, the largest for Ecuador for $1.2 billion just a few months ago. Last year was a $4.2 billion for Peru sustainable bond, the largest green bond by a sovereign. And the pipeline of debt for nature swap, I think, is also something to look at because it's part of the innovative financing mechanism. So when the debt is restructured and part of the proceed goes to the climate solutions, adaptation, those are part of mobilizing funding that countries can benefit. So it's a win-win. On one hand, you restructure the debt and reduce it, and on the other hand, instead of that money going to countries outside the countries, it's kind of invested into the country. And as a regional solution, at the next COP in Dubai, we are going to launch the Africa and Middle East food security and food system transformation as a adaptation solution, which is a $10 billion public-private partnership with the two regions, and the government and institutions in the two regions as an adaptation solution, but something that is also not controversial. It's one of the very few topics that is not controversial. It's about feeding our people. And food security and food system transformation is an important one. Just a last example to add to why it's important to collaborate and address some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we look forward to the launch and for highlighting that important agenda of food security, which, as His Excellency pointed out, links very much to the land agenda as well as water, and we can't discount our oceans and the impact desal has and the reliance on that most recently quite often for agriculture. And you highlighted points on financing, which we will get to in a bit, but before we continue, I'd like to see if there are any questions or comments from the audience at this time. I think the audience might be shy, but you're welcome to come in with any questions or comments in Arabic as well, and I can translate for the, hopefully, for the panelists. I see it's the last day, and yes, hi.
Hello, everyone. Just to clarify some of the gaps and challenges that we have heard regarding the needs. So it seems that to have the enough financing is to have data, has been indicated. But what are the challenges in having these data, and how can countries who are developed help in assisting having those assessments regarding data of the challenges and the needs to have concrete case studies, specific examples in that regard? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see if there's anything else and we can group them together. That's fine. Excellency, would you like to go first?
Thank you. And I think finance is a very important enabler to deliver the solution. As my colleagues pointed out, and there has to be more work to establish the models, the business models that enable the flow of finance. Finance, of course, look for sustainability. I mean, financial institution will not invest into businesses that are viewed risky or may result in a net loss. So there, I think the policy, the incentives, or maybe even the business models has to be developed to really create these kind of modalities that enable the flow of finance in a smooth way that really both, result in net positive financial outcome to the funders, but also achieve the economic, environmental, and social objectives. And I think still the current modalities is not yet really catching up with that. So there is need to, I think, financial modalities, innovation, business models that enable the flow of finance. This is very important because we still, I think, finance is really lagging behind. What's available now is way really below what is needed to achieve, whether it's in climate or biodiversity or land, which is interrelated. And I think one way also to look at deficiencies, because we are also having losses. I mean, the current systems are not really ideal. We have to look at the full supply chain. I give you an example. If we look at the food supply chain, and I touch upon the relation between food and climate and biodiversity. Now in Sharm el-Sheikh, supply system for food took, I think an adequate space of discussion, which highlighted more than 30% of greenhouse gases are related to the food supply chain, from agriculture, transportation, manufacturing, and utilization. If you look at the food systems or the food supply chain, we have almost 30% in food loss and waste, loss in the production and transportation and waste when the food comes to our table. So really, not only we need to pour more financial resources, but we have to utilize the already dispersed financial resources to existing supply chains in a better way. That itself, 30% loss, it can equate to trillions of dollars. So I think there is already some financial resources allocated in existing supply chains that we need to utilize. Here in Saudi Arabia, the country has adopted the food security strategy and established now maybe one of the few, maybe in the region, food security agency. Its job is to reduce food loss and waste by 50%. And that will result in impact on environment, and impact on resource and water utilization, positively in energy utilization, as well as impact on climate as well. Because when you produce food, there is a CO2 footprint. So really, when you cut that loss by 50% or more or less, that will result on a positive impact on climate. The same I can go also in the water cycle. There is a lot of loss in the water cycle as well. There is the loss in the network. Sometimes 30% in various countries is lost. So that's greenhouse gases. That's resources lost. That's finance lost. So, and I think, yes, we need to allocate financial resources, but I think we need to go back to existing supply chains and improve them and have to minimize the loss and waste in those supply chains.
Thank you. I think maybe I'll shift over to the next team, and since I might change the order a bit since we've been talking so much about financing, and ask two of our panelists to come in to discuss again the lessons lost, best practices, and opportunities, but also if you see, as we mentioned, some of the challenges that you're facing, for example, with data or similar, from the financing support perspective. And I'd like to start, please, with Ms. Nouron, and then we can jump over to Dr. Bradley.
Super. Thank you so much for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be with distinguished speakers and subject matter experts. So, of course, as we can see, there is a lot of momentum when it comes to climate finance and the understanding that there is a need to engage also the private sector. However, although a lot of countries have now looked into sustainable finance policies at the level of implementation, when it comes to adaptation financing specifically, it is still largely unaffected. There is a nascent understanding as well when it comes to climate finance, particularly on adaptation with financial institutions, as well as adaptation and resilience needs. Given that there is no specific clear definition on what climate adaptation financing is for financial institutions. So it's not as straightforward as climate mitigation, for instance, where they would know, yes, we would go to renewables, we would finance this and that. It's not as straightforward. As esteemed speakers mentioned, it is multi-sectoral, affects several sectors at the same time, and it has to be addressed in a completely different manner. And also adaptation projects are usually found in small scale, and identifying the project requires a lot of research as well, and in-country support, impact measurement solutions, all which require a lot of support from expertise and incurs a lot of costs as well. So in that case, sometimes it's seen that adaptation project may not necessarily generate immediate solutions or return on financing, which becomes a challenging issue to bring in the private sector to the discussion. And in solving that, there needs to be a change of the narrative. So we need to, instead of looking at climate adaptation as a return on investment from a financial perspective, we need to also look at it from a quantification of loss and damage. So that, for instance, what are we going to be avoiding and how can we adopt a multi-sectoral approach, whether engaging public, private sectors together, and there has to be an ongoing dialogue also between those two sectors. The business case itself, so that we can be able to say, for instance, that I'm investing 800 million as an example in early warning systems, and in that I've saved 30% of damage that could have happened. I prevented loss of 30 billion in recovery costs, and I even saved lives or saved resources, as His Excellency was mentioning, the food losses that we see across the process. All of these elements should be taken into account in as well the adaptation financing, which is something that we need to ensure that the private sector also sees the value of. So what we are doing as UNEP-FI, so if you allow me to introduce UNEP-FI as well, it is a partnership between the United Nations and the global finance industry, covering the banking, the insurance, and the investment in partnership with the PRI. We work together, we are member-based as well, a member-based institution, and we work together with our members to help set industry-based standards and mainstream sustainable finance across the sector. We have over 300 members globally, and when it comes to the banking specifically, we have almost 50% of the global banking industry. One of our flagship initiatives is the Principles for Responsible Banking, which is the only framework actually that addresses the the banking sector from start to end, looking at the strategic, operational, and transactional level of the bank's sustainable finance journey, and was launched in 2019. And one of the main elements is that we're looking at supporting banking institutions to identify their impact of their portfolio on the environment and society. Based on that, they set target. And almost 90% or more of the banking institutions of the members globally have identified climate as a key impact area that they need to look at. And as well, one of them is adaptation specifically for this region, which is very relevant and is a much needed element. However, the starting point becomes very challenging to them, is how to address it. So we came together with the banks and we issued a report, and I would invite you all to look at it. And it's called Adapting to a New Climate in the Middle East and North Africa region. So this report is actually a supplement to the global report that we issued, which is Adapting to a New Climate. And it addresses specifically the challenges of climate adaptation financing in the region. What is the current status? How do we need to move forward, engaging policymakers and having this public-private dialogue of ongoing for climate adaptation? And with that report, we've now have established a working group of 26 banks globally, representing all regions, to work together on identifying these elements. What is climate adaptation financing? How can we pinpoint it? Because a lot of banks, they do have adaptation financing, but they may not be able to identify it because this is not the main aim or the main purpose of the project that they're financing. So these are elements that we want to also be able to see, because adaptation financing exists, but it's unseen at times as well by those institutions. So we're hoping that this group of banks also can be able to accelerate that by developing this guidance document, which hopefully will be brought to life in November. It will be published as a guidance document to banks on how to set climate adaptation targets. On the insurance front, so similar to the principles for responsible banking that we have, there is the principles for sustainable insurance, which was also launched in 2012. And one of the things that we have is that it is hosting the V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility for the vulnerable 20 countries. And one of the aims of this project is to scale the adaptation and resilience financing for micro, small and medium enterprises in V20 countries, coupled, of course, with aggregating demand for insurance projects. And we also have another project called the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaborative, in which we are working with a group of around a dozen development financial institutions to advance thinking on adaptation and resilience, to develop tools to scale up adaptation financing. And the collaborative hopes to address three main things. So the first one is physical risk assessment, which is the starting point. We need to understand what the physical risks are to see what the action needs to look like. Then measuring adaptation impact and finding the appropriate approaches to that. And finally, explore financing approaches to adaptation and resilience. And of course, the collaborative focuses on the global south, currently on sub-Saharan Africa as well, but it also engages with the MENA. But one of the things that also we wanted to shed light on is the need for collaboration of different sectors together, and just as His Excellency was mentioning, and also other esteemed colleagues. So understanding that addressing one adaptation topic is not just going to be through one sector, through one ministry, through one area. It needs a round-table discussion of all involved sectors together. And just a final note on the report that I just mentioned as well, this shows a demonstration of collaboration, because this was part of a joint project called the SDG Climate Facility Project, which addresses the nexus between climate action and human security. And it's actually led by UNDP. So it brings together a group of UN agencies, including UN Disaster Risk and Reduction, UN Habitat, the League of Arab States, the Arab Water Council, and of course UNEP to bring in the finance component. And it is funded by the Swedish government. So just to show how the collaboration between those entities are also working together to advance that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Very useful tools you've given us to refer to. Let me hand it over to Dr. Bradley to give us his perspective from the Islamic Development Bank.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rafif, and thank you to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for hosting us here. I think it's been a very successful week so far, so we're really happy to be here. I think I mentioned this yesterday in one of the presentations that I gave. I think people often think of development banks. We have World Bank here and Islamic Development Bank as purely financing bodies, but I think one thing that's really important to emphasize is that we also do knowledge generation and exchange, capacity building, technical assistance, and also we really focus on partnerships. So I think looking at the topic that we're focusing on today, we're talking about cross-sectoral, cross-country, regional, institutional. I think it's not just finance, but some of these other aspects that are also important as well. And again, particularly looking at the nexus of water, food, climate change, ocean, and land, I think, again, you need a multi-dimensional approach. So what I thought I'd do is just give 3 examples of programs that we're engaging in, and then 2 examples of innovative finance. I won't forget the financing because often it comes back to this. So firstly, Islamic Development Bank, we have what we call a bespoke mechanism, which we call reverse linkage. And this is we're a South-South institution, but the emphasis here is on exchanging knowledge between one country that's had experience in certain activities with others which have demand for the same sets of knowledge. Now, this can be between our member countries. For example, we have 57 member countries, but it can also be from outside our member countries into our member countries. And increasingly, this can be around technology related to adaptation and climate change, but any topics really. And for example, new technologies around early warning systems and things like this could be activated through this program. Secondly, last year, Islamic Development Bank launched what we call the Food Security Response Program, which is a $10.5 billion program looking at food security focus. But as we're talking about today, obviously this also relates to water security, perhaps energy security, climate change, and various other aspects. And the elements of this program were both relief, so short-term relief of acute challenges, but then longer-term resilience building across value chains and things like this as well. So I think this is a good example. And this also includes technologies such as soil mapping to determine how climate change may affect areas in the future, and value chain approaches as well. Finally, in terms of programs, we have a program called Taramon, which in Arabic means solidarity. And this is a community and a platform which convenes civil society organisations and provides visibility, funding, capacity building and knowledge. And so again, in terms of digitalisation and how this can contribute to some of the solutions to these challenges, this incorporates crowdfunding elements and also Islamic social finance and is multi-sector. So again, we see increasing interest in this platform for climate-related activities. And then finally, just on innovative financing, two examples. In 2019, we established a sustainable finance framework under which we can issue green and sustainability sukuk. So green sukuk, and to date, we've issued about $5 billion in green and sustainability sukuk. Now, green sukuk has a number of categories which are eligible, which do include sort of land, environment, and nature elements. But admittedly, to date, and I think Dr. Osama was referring to this, most of the financing has gone into traditional sectors such as energy efficiency. And so the next challenge for us and the community more broadly is how do you channel more of that financing into nature-related investments. But I think there's potential there. This is a well-established mechanism which could be leveraged. And then finally, the last innovative financing mechanism that I'd like to talk about is we're currently doing some research on takaful, which is Islamic insurance, and how this could be expanded or improved for climate resilience purposes. So how could we improve the extension of insurance services, particularly, say, to rural communities who may be suffering more from climate shocks, and how can we integrate them in with insurance systems which can help them prevent moving back into poverty when either climate or non-climate related disasters occur. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much for having us here today.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for highlighting the role of MDBs very well. As a number of our panelists have already highlighted, the importance of preparing ahead of time, of building it in upstream. And so I'd like to hand it over to Ms. Aya to discuss with us the lessons learned and some best practices and opportunities for anticipatory action to build resilience.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. And I think I'm the lucky one to speak last because everything has already been noted. So I think I'm just going to focus on trying to reflect on lessons, but also the challenges from WFP perspective, but also in collaboration with all the different entities, of course. I think when it comes to early action or anticipatory action, it's where the agenda on climate is, there is the climate action where we're dealing with something that has already happened, but we're also dealing with something that is yet to happen. And the question is, how much do we know about it? it. And the more we know about it, the more we can be ready. And I reflect here on what Margaret was talking about in terms of the early action for the disasters, whether climate or otherwise. But when it comes to climate, there is, of course, like a life-saving component, but there's also a cost component. And more importantly, there is the knowledge component. If we know what we're getting ourselves into before we have our backs to the wall and have to act now, then we can really structure what is useful, what needs to happen when, and of course make it more efficient financially. So I think this is in essence, this is what anticipatory action is all about. And then it becomes an issue of how it connects to everything else. So when we look at climate disasters, but there are also the climate impacts. And this is where our anticipatory action agenda splits into whether it's shocks or stressors. So on the one hand, we have the climate impacts of rainfall disruption or increasing temperatures. And on that agenda, we, as WFP, and again with all the different partners, we try to take a bit of a no-regret approach, where we are saying, okay, if the rain is not coming at a certain time, then we need to advise our farmers through extension services that already exist in the country on how to irrigate or how to make sure that, like His Excellency was saying, using the existing resources in the most efficient manner. So this is where it comes to being a planning on information. This is the climate information service part of it. And it's the last mile where we actually reach to communities and can speak to them about what is needed on their end to adapt. But then there is also, of course, the DRR component or the more emergency component. And this is where we try to use the anticipatory action tools and models to trigger early action on specific shocks. So this can be in the form of, like WFP does, cash-based transfers, for example. So it can be by restructuring the timing of the transfer so that it arrives to the people before the disaster actually happens in terms of flood or drought or like something we know will come. But we're also working on our social protection systems to make them more shock responsive. So again, we're trying to link up with existing systems on the government side, because this is institutional after all. So we have to work with their systems, but then make them more shock responsive. So I think in this area, I'm reflecting again on what colleagues have already said, but I think part of it is also maybe on challenges, I would say. And we talked about data, and we also had a question on that. It is a problem. It's a big problem. And when you look at data, we look at both sides of it. So we need data to know what to do, but we also need data and evidence generation to prove what we have done. And in both, again, WFP, together with so many partners, are trying to figure it out. So what we have seen in our experience is that, yes, there is innovation and technology needed, but there is also underutilization of existing technologies and models. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that we are using whatever is existing to the best of its ability, and then see what else is needed to enhance it. And again, that's both on the models and the forecasting, but also on the evidence generation, which takes me to my last point around the finance issue. And I think, again, many points were raised. We do have a problem with preparing the proposal in a way that the financiers want, but we also have a problem of some of the financiers not seeing it except as a monetary value. And I think bringing these two together speaks to a little bit on the evidence generation, again, like proving that what we are doing is useful, but at the same time is a cost-saving measure. So from a financial perspective, it is seen as something that is beneficial for monetary value efficient, but also sustainability and human saving efficient. So I think this is, again, what WFP is trying to do in the financial bottlenecks. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think you said it well. Before we wrap up and go to final remarks, I'd like to see once again if there's any new questions coming in after we've now discussed financing in more detail and preparation upstream. I see a question in the corner. Yes, great.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers for these informative sessions. It is really useful. I think all of the speakers agreed that the integration and holistic approach is necessary to combat the climate change in terms of water, energy, food nexus. I believe there is another very important component as well, which is the transfer of technology. because without the technology, we cannot meet and address the climate change. So as the speaker from international agencies, what role you can play in order to make sure that the advanced country transfer the technology to the other countries and to other nations? Thank you.
Oh, excuse me? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I think transfer of technology, knowledge sharing, capacity building are extremely important enablers in addition to finance and deployment of financial solutions. This is extremely important. I will just highlight an example of how we try to achieve that in an environmental context. I would like to point out to the G20 global initiatives on coral reef. Basically, the global initiative tried to address the issue of coral reef degradation and restoration. We lost around 30% of the global coral reefs, and we actually set to lose more moving forward, significantly more, and we might even be threatened to have a coral reef totally disappear, later in the century if we don't reverse the cycle. And we found that there is a lot of goodwill initiatives, a lot of work, but the technology is not there. The innovation is not there. So really, the Coral Reef initiative focused on technology developments and knowledge transfer. So the way we set it up, it's really, first of all, created a network of institutions where actually innovation ideas are supported with two conditions. First of all the knowledge is publicly, so that nobody will take the technology and try to really, create financial values, because we feel that really the value achieved by working on coral reef restoration is immense. And we, as at least the platform itself, its job is to really share knowledge. Another thing, we had to put another condition. Whenever a developed country come up with a proposal, there has to be partners with developing or at least developed countries in the proposal, so that there will be no monopoly on knowledge, so that a proposal not accepted by a developed country unless the institution, if an institution stationed in a developed country and had a proposal to the global platform, one condition for acceptance is to establish partnership with institutions in developing or least developed countries, so that we facilitate the generation and transfer of knowledge. So I'm sure there are many other examples, and then all the knowledge generators are open source. So I think I agree with them. I'm sure there is so many other modalities in knowledge transfer. When there is, let's say, development projects, there should be also some knowledge transfer components, capacity building components as well. So just I wanted to pinpoint an example to just support your point that knowledge transfer, innovation technology, leveraging innovation technology is very important.
Great, thank you. Do any of the other speakers? Please.
Yeah, I think I can just add one point to that. Is, again, part of the learning we have seen is that the transfer has to have a component of co-leading from the national government and the communities. So if there is a technology somewhere, but it's 100% new, it's very difficult to transfer it, because it's not part of what the communities are already using or what the institutions are already supporting. So part of the successful knowledge transfer examples we've seen, like the example of the Coral program, is that it has to have a base, and then you're trying to enhance it through the knowledge transfer. So you're adding to something, and then if you don't have that base, then it's about the institutional capacity of the very basic ideas, and then a stakeholder consultation on which models work for you, what kind of information do you want to collect, and how you want to use it, and then we select the transfer accordingly. So I think this is also part of the conversation that should happen on the national level, to select what systems are more aligned with the planning of the national government, and then going for a transfer on a need basis, and not just select a model somewhere in a country and say we want to adapt this here without looking at what is already existing, because then we're imposing, and usually a lot of resistance or misalignment happens. So that's also part of our experience on that front. Thank you.
Yeah, I think to complement the previous speakers, and also I want to highlight one point that His Excellency Osama mentioned. The best practice business models are important. I think quite often, if you want to save time, the technology cooperation is an important one. It's part of one of the 6 pillars of the food security and food system transformation I mentioned earlier. So on one hand, you have the technology cooperation. On the other hand, we have a number of solutions that work, that exist. So we can scale those solutions, and the knowledge sharing helps to avoid that in other countries, people start developing like if it's the first time. So how this type of forum or other events can help us to share those solutions so that others can leapfrog and avoid the same mistakes. So that's the second point. The third one, linking to the development banking sector. Quite often when we work with a lot of development banking sectors in the countries in our member state to help green their pipeline or the portfolio of projects, they are not interested into hiring a lot of technical people to develop those projects or get them market ready. They know how to do the banking part of it. But to go from ideation to get the project market ready, that technical assistance needs to be done somewhere, and that requires funding. So quite often, when we help countries translate their NDCs or the development plans into investment plans with flagship programs, which are market ready, quite often you have investors ready to go for it, but they need to be market ready. So on the other hand, I think my last point is more on making sure that we, if I take the case of the seeds, the small island states, there are many regional development banks or global development banks which are not interested into small size ticket projects. 10, 15, $20 million, they will say the transaction cost is the same as a $200, $500 million. So aggregation becomes a solution for small island states, which means that we can bring together a number of projects to reach a certain scale and make it attractive to the private sector. I just want to add those 3 points to the financing parts. Yeah.
Great. Oh, hold on. You wanted to come in?
Yes,
Okay.
I wanted to just reflect on the question on data and link that also to the question on technology, and just to reaffirm the importance of having sound data, because we have to have informed decision makers so that when we ask our decision makers for particular interventions, policy, governance actions, they have to have the data and the information on which to base this. So just to reflect on linking that to utilizing also existing platforms that we have, like South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation, which includes peer-to-peer exchanges, transfer of technology and best practices, so that we don't have to always be starting from scratch, and we should not be, because there are several other countries, regions that are implementing sound practices, utilizing technology, and we should be able to share this information. So we're still sometimes operating in silos, either within our own countries or within sectors, and we have to really come together with a more integrated approach. Just linking that also to the SDGs, while we have 17 SDGs with individual names and numbers, there are integrated actions that are required. So we have to really rely on each other in this, but just to reaffirm sound data and utilizing, as Excellency said, various partners, including academia. The academic institutions have a wealth of data because they have research students constantly probing and investigating boundaries, and we have to integrate the academics more in the decision-making process and have access to data that's standardized and data that has been verified and has the integrity that we need.
Great. Dr. Bradley?
Yeah, thank you. just to come in there. So I think there's a couple of elements. I mentioned that as MDBs we cover different sections of the value chain. So one is in knowledge generation. So where we work in knowledge generation products, it's usually where there's a need to understand the topic better and or overcome barriers and or scale a market. So I gave the example of Tuckerful for climate resilience. So this is an area that we saw where there's potential for this market to be bigger, for support to be expanded. So what we do is that we work with, in this case, another public sector partner to try and understand this. What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? And then I think a point that Dr. Osama made is once that product is done, then that's a public document which can be used by anybody to understand the topic better. Then the other thing that I mentioned was what we have is reverse linkage mechanism, which is a bespoke product which is set up to facilitate exchange between countries. So if you have, for example, Saudi Arabia has experience with revegetation and on large scale, and another country X also wants to explore this opportunity, then we can facilitate this connection between the governments in Saudi Arabia, for example, and country A, B or C to help, as the other colleague mentioned, not reinvent the wheel, but then build on those experiences. So I think these are some examples, practical examples, but I think there's always more that can be done for dissemination and capacity building, and also integrating knowledge from the bottom up, I think, as other colleagues have talked about, as always we can do more. Thanks.
Great. And I can just add from the development bank side that many of our projects across the different development banks include capacity building throughout the design of the project. And the idea is to ensure that the information is there, the best practices are applied through different forms of technical assistance, as well as now the lens, and it's very important, integrated into all projects of climate co-benefits. So while it may be a water management project, as His Excellency highlighted, you might be doing work on water losses and improving the network and how that contributes to financing and adaptation. And so the idea is to link it into all our projects, and I think that's the case among many of our partners here on the stage. So we are at time, but I think we have just 2 minutes since we started a bit late, just to give final remarks, very brief final remarks from all our speakers, and I'll start with His Excellency.
Well, I think it's very important to emphasize the point that we need to address the issues in totality and not in isolation, because you cannot address one issue like climate in isolation from land or biodiversity or pollution or it is all or habitat loss. It's all interrelated. Also, we need, I think, all the enablers to be available in terms of the policies, in terms of the institutions, finances, knowledge transfer, capacity building. These should be really both on national and international levels. Both has to be really addressed in the proper modalities so that we really achieve the objective. Also, all stakeholders are involved. From the individual behavior, when he just use water or food or others, it's changing the daily habits to be more mindful of resources, more mindful of your individual footprint, all the way to the academic institution, to the business, to the government. All stakeholders should be involved. And I think not from an environmental perspective, but from a lifestyle perspective that really focuses on the basically sustainability in production as well as in consumption, because I think these are inherent in all the losses that we are seeing and the negative impacts that we are seeing.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Just a couple of points in closing and just reflecting on my earlier intervention on reducing hazards. Almost 30% of financial resources invested in disaster risk reduction go towards early warning systems, early warning platforms, technology for early warning, monitoring, also at the community level. So I know we were speaking a lot about financial investment, and this is an area that will continue to require significant investment. The UN Secretary General in 2022 launched an initiative called Early Warning for All Initiative, and at COP28 we will be focusing a little bit on this and helping to promote this, and not to downplay the importance of communities in the early warning process. So I also spoke about data. We need hard data, but we also can utilize anecdotal data, soft data. Communities that have been living in areas for decades, for generations, and information is passed down. So while we have data that we can use, we must not underestimate engaging with stakeholders at the community level to hear from them. They can tell you, they can look at the weather, they can look at the moon, they can look at the sun and tell you what's going to happen in a day or two. And this is important. So just to reflect on accessing data from different levels. I also want to just reflect on nature-based solutions in disaster risk reduction. The ocean systems, coral reefs as a natural barrier for ocean waves, mangroves for storm surge protection, seagrass beds that dampen water flow in the inner coastal areas, and that we have to continue to ensure that the ecosystems are sound and that they are restored. And linked to this and to the financing is that we have to put more effort into the economic valuation of these ecosystems to be able to record what their financial value is in order to help decision makers to keep them, because they are very often at risk for development initiatives. So nature-based solutions are very important. I've spoken about the marine environment, but even on the terrestrial side, for slope stabilization, having terrestrial banks is very important. So we need to just ensure sound investment and management of ecosystems as part of the disaster risk reduction solution.
Great, thank you. Nuran?
Thank you so much. So, of course, I second everything that's been said before, and just on a final note, definitely the collaboration, working together, breaking the silos, but also trying to issue and have standards that are specific to financial institutions, to the banking sector, so that this can also support their engagement on financing for climate adaptation, having metrics to identify the climate adaptation projects that they're financing and looking at their portfolios and being able to pick those out of there. And also one more thing is that, yes, we discussed banking and insurance, but there are so many different financing options, and diversification of climate adaptation financing is also important. We now see in generally discussions on the role of philanthropies, for instance, impact investors, and all of these entities that might have a higher risk appetite than, for instance, banks, insurance, and all that. And that's one of the elements that also support in the de-risking of climate adaptation project. So I just wanted to leave with that note, having this phased approach, and hopefully we can advance climate adaptation in the MENA.
Thank you. Dr. Bradley?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the audience for being here today. I'll close with, I'll borrow a remark I heard yesterday in one of the sessions from a colleague from one of the Egyptian banks, actually. And this colleague said that it's not biodiversity and nature that needs finance, but it's finance that needs biodiversity and nature. And so I think that there's a realization of these increasing connections and the cross-sectoral nature of these things, but also somewhat of a reframing, which I think is occurring at the moment, on how we might move forward on some of these issues and really integrate nature, biodiversity, water, land, food together. And so I think, you know, at least as a stimulating sort of point to leave on from my side, I think this is something to consider, and I think we can all work together to move forward in this sense. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, again, just I think a final note from my side would be to pay more attention to what the baseline tells us in terms of what the institutions already have, what the communities already know and can provide, and then try to collaborate between the agencies and donors and the banks and all of us to try to build upon that and make it as efficient and enhanced as possible instead of just imposing with new systems that are new to them. I think that's always a good starting point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, for me, I think I would like to first thank again the organizers and Your Excellency. Please convey the best wishes from our President and Chair, His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, for inviting us into this event. I'm very impressed by what I have been hearing and learning from what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been doing in this space. I was telling some of your colleagues from the Ministry of Energy yesterday that we don't need to wait for an event like this to learn about this. So please talk about it more. So, but very quickly on the final remarks, I think based on the lesson learned from our side in GGGI, there are three aspects that we need to link together. One is the access to sustainable services linked to the enhancement of adaptation capacities and linked to green jobs. Once we manage to link those three and demonstrate that there is job creation opportunity when it comes to adaptation solutions, then it's easy to talk to government officials. When you talk to ministries in charge of finance or transport from many LDCs and seed countries, and you talk about green jobs opportunity from adaptation solutions, it resonates more than saying it's only climate actions. That's number one. Number two, to conclude, is that the adaptation solutions, when we market them, if I can use that term, we need to talk about not because there are climate solutions or we need to do them, but because they make business sense. The private sector understands that. They do it because it makes business sense. It's important for climate, to address climate impact, but it's also because there are economic opportunities linked to those adaptation solutions. So those are my two final remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keeping in mind time, and I don't think I could summarize accurately everything that was shared, I would just like to highlight a few points in closing. I think what's been very helpful with today's panel is that they've given us specific interventions in areas that we should focus on moving forward. Looking at policies and planning, how to put in the planning and adaptation early on from at the national and local government, but also the importance of data at different levels and how relevant that is to not only planning, but to the financial institutions, to the legal framework, and as well as to how to adapt things to the local level. As well as one element that kept coming up quite clearly is the narrative. How do we address the narrative, both for either the financing institutions, what works and what will appeal to them, but also what we're already doing. Some of the work that's already been taking place is also can address issues of adaptation, but also the narrative at the local level, how to bring those technologies and adapt them to what works for different contexts. As well as what kept coming out, and I think it's good to end on, is using existing systems. We have the systems in place, we can adapt them and use them to enhance the resilience and adaptation for these sectors. Thank you so much for joining us, and please a round of applause for our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Excellent, yeah.